This episode is brought to you by the House of Chanel.
Join us for Chanel Connects, the Venice Biennale edition. We've taken up residence in Italy to introduce you to the artists, curators, thinkers, and makers behind the world's most important exhibition of contemporary art. Guests include actress Vicky Krieps.
I've been trying to push myself to a place where I let go.
Artist Julien Creuset.
My studio looked like a secret kitchen.
And renowned gallerist Sadie Coles.
The main thing is to keep your ears open.
Listen to Chanel Connects on Chanel.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's partly driven by a market that's very interested in so-called alternative modernisms or other modernisms, right? But there's also a huge generation, 2 or 3 generations now, of young artists who began to mine that period too.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Contemporary art comes in many shapes and forms. But close your eyes and think of what an artist looks like, and 9 times out of 10, I bet you are still thinking of a painter in front of a canvas. If recent interest from museums and galleries is any indication, however, that image should be joined by another one, the fiber artist. Think of a weaver at the loom or a quilt maker laboriously stitching together layers of fabric. The textile arts have experienced a quiet but steady groundswell of interest in the last decades, and recently, I've noticed that it feels as if it is kicked into a new, even higher level. From the many kinds of textile-based art throughout the most recent Venice Biennale to the major show, Woven Histories, Textiles, and Modern Abstraction, which is on a tour of some of North America's most important museums right now. As many textile scholars will tell you, tapestry was once as exalted as painting as an art form, and it may be so again. This surge of interest is bringing new audiences, new histories, and new vocabularies into the center of the action that are worth getting familiar with. And to unravel all the different threads, I turned to Elisa Arthur, a scholar who looked at the tangled history of fiber art in her book, String Felt Thread, The Hierarchy of Art and Craft in American Art. And more importantly, she's been closely observing and encouraging the contemporary boom as the chief curator at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. Elisa Arthur, thanks for joining us on The Art Angle.
Thanks for having me.
So what I want to talk about is what I consider a pretty big topic, which is about the movement of fiber arts and how in vogue it is today. But I want to start with the most basic possible way to enter into this subject. For people for whom it is an unfamiliar term, what does fiber arts mean?
It's an umbrella term. It has to do with objects that are made out of fibers of some sort, and we can go into more detail about that if you want to. But there tends to be an intention on the part of the artist to present that work in an exhibition context, an art context, as a work of art, in other words. So not, say, a textile that might be designed for a commercial application.
Right.
But even there, you might find blurred areas. But it can refer to just a tremendous number of different kinds of objects and techniques. It can be a woven piece made on a loom. And even within that categories, there's different kinds of weavings. For instance, a tapestry versus a plain weave. It can be a printed textile. So you have a woven cloth, there's something hand printed on it or painted or dyed fabric. And those, again, are meant to be displayed as works of art. It could be a whole range of things that we refer to as off-loom. So That's like any kind of knotted, braided, or in the art world, it usually goes by the word plaiting. It can be knitted. It can be embroidered. It could be beaded. It could be a basket. And there's many different types of basketry techniques. It could be lace. That's an open work form of textile. It could be a gauze. It could be crochet. You've got quilts in there and quilts. Other sewn textiles.
And also this other category that is and isn't the same as a lot of that, which is like just contemporary sculpture made with fabric.
That's true, where you have artists who will often bring together, say, found textiles, often not altered in really dramatic ways, but maybe sewn together to create a structure or to be hanging in space in some way.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get at with just starting with the definition, which is that for people who are professionals in this kind of thing, fiber art is a subcategory of contemporary art, but at the same time, within fiber art, there's a tremendous number of maybe contradictory things going on. You know, there are people working with really traditional practices, like indigenous artists looking to traditional practices, and then there are contemporary artists who are doing conceptual stuff.
That's right.
With found fabrics.
Yeah, and within the fiber arts, if you're going to use it as an umbrella term, those are all art worlds in and of themselves that are very vibrant, like the quilt world or the printed textile world, which is often goes by like surface design. They have their own organized exhibitions, their own publications, their own awards. So these are huge art worlds within this category, and they exist within the contemporary art world. We just tend to either not recognize it or you're just not aware of it.
Some of your scholarship has focused on the tension between these things. Do you think it's a good term or do you think it's confusing? Do you think we should focus on the specific worlds, or do you think there is something about the material that's important?
That's a hard question for me to answer. I don't know. I mean, if you are an artist who's a quilter, you may really enjoy being with other quilt artists and showing in that context. It may not matter to you what's happening in the so-called center of the contemporary world. That's not where you're looking for affirmation, right? But you could also be a quilt artist who works very comfortably between, say, the quilt world as it exists and the contemporary art world, and you show in both of those places and you work with different languages, right? I used to really mind the whole fiber art label because, of course, you're attaching a qualifier there. But now I think of it as actually pretty useful. I mean, what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
But you could also just refer to much of it as sculpture,
right?
Which a lot of artists do. And I do that all the time, too. I guess it really is context dependent, like who I'm talking to, who I'm presenting work to as a curator, the way I'm going to refer to it.
Before we go any further, I want to ask you if I'm wrong, because I was reading your book, Stringfelt Thread, which is from 2010, so a little while ago, a good book on the history of fiber art and the debates within the field. And your conclusion begins, today, fiber seems to be everywhere in the contemporary art world. So here I am thinking that fiber art is having a moment, and that's not just me. Many people say that. But is it? Has something new happened? Has there been a phase change in the last few years? Or is this just part of a longer term trajectory? Or is it some combination of the two?
It's probably part of a long-term trajectory, but I think something has happened just within the past couple of years. So that sentence that you just quoted there, that conclusion, I needed something that brought that history to the present, right, that I was writing about from the 60s and 70s. And I was seeing this work out there. I don't think it was particularly on the radar for a lot of people. Certainly my peers in the world of modernist art history weren't necessarily interested in this. This book was very difficult to even get a publisher for. So
really,
when I started getting to the point where I was looking for an editor and a press, must have been 2007 or so. I mean, I went through maybe a dozen presses and got rejections. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that it's so outside of what at that time was considered like legitimate, authoritative modernist scholarship. Like it just didn't fit any story, right, of sculpture. And then somebody would say, well, we once did a textile book, and they would show it to me and it would be a history of Chinese silk. That was the only way they could conceptualize what this was. So I put that last chapter in thinking like, all right, if I can tie it at least to this phenomenon that I see happening, I might have said it was everywhere to me, but I mean, I'm not sure that anybody else thought about it that way. But this was also the moment of the rise of like yarn bombing.
Right.
And so you had...
I wonder if people even remember yarn bombing.
All that?
Yarn-based graffiti art.
Right. And so that's coming from a different place. That's not necessarily coming from the center of the art world. Like that's related to DIY youth communities and creative people who just generally are interested in street art, right? I was like, oh, okay. So maybe if I also like mention that. And so I took the manuscript to the editor, who became the editor, Richard Morrison, great editor. And I talked about those things. And he's like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. That's really interesting. Send me the manuscript. So I had to just sort of get other people to see that this was actually something that was there at that moment. I really think it was at a beginning point, but it was enough for me to talk about and see as like a legitimate legacy of this history of the 60s and 70s that I was talking about.
For sure. And maybe that relates to some of the ambiguities we were talking about at the top, which is that some of this is like the presence of textiles within a world that had grown very diverse in terms of what material was using, what kind of conceptual strategies they were using. And then that, again, is a little different, but also connected to the history of the textile art.
Because in the 60s and 70s, this period I was writing about, and into the 1980s, the art world changed dramatically after that, right? And so you had this opportunity for artists working around the world, coming from traditions that didn't necessarily separate art from craft. There weren't these hierarchies the way we understand them in the Western world, who would just enter the arena using textiles like Doho Sa.
Yeah, describe what he does.
I'm most familiar with his beautiful, large-scale replicas of homes that he's lived in, apartments, and also traditional Korean childhood home.
Right, done in these fabric panels that are very beautifully embroidered.
Exactly. He was very open about the fact that he was working with traditional Korean embroidery artists and seamstresses. And I was like, oh, that's really fascinating. This is someone coming from a world and an artistic tradition where you don't just write that off, right? That's what gives the work its meaning. And so that was a huge shift in the contemporary art world where suddenly you could use these materials and you didn't have to necessarily like suppress historic meanings, personal memories related to textiles. It was legitimate to do that. So that changed, and that has continued to just develop.
But do you think something has happened recently?
Right. So to me, what's happened is that there's just like a massive acceleration that I never thought I would see in my professional lifetime. Honestly, I thought where we were in like the 90s, early 2000s, okay, that's what it's going to look like in this world. And it's not necessarily going to change anything for, say, artists who were trained as weavers and then tried to remake their practices as sculptors in the late 60s and 70s. People like Sheila Hicks or Francois Grossin. Like, it's not going to really matter for them, right? They've been written off for a long time. But that has even changed, where those artists are suddenly, quote unquote, rediscovered. It's partly driven by a market that's very interested in so-called alternative modernisms or other modernisms, right? But there's also a huge generation, 2 or 3 generations now, of young artists who began to mine that period too. And they really are a huge force in like the revival of all of this historic fiber art. So they're very into it. The acceleration is really intense. And that's why I think you can find people now write it off like, oh, well, there's the required fiber work in the exhibition.
Right.
But I don't think it's a trend. I really don't. I think that this is here to stay.
You just came back from the Venice Biennale, and before this recording started, I was talking about the New York Times review by Jason Farrago of that show. It's very dismissive, and one of the things he says is, you know, as with all such big shows, here's the weaving, here's the tapestry. So is there a moment that you would mark or a landmark in the recent past when you sensed that something had changed?
So when the book was published, there was a real intense positive reaction to it, which caught me by surprise because, of course, I'm in an academic world where nobody cared about it one iota and just thought it was like bonkers that anybody would write about something with the word craft in the title because very passé. That was coming from fiber departments and students, yes. And so I went on like a huge tour of just talking to people, and I was just so surprised. I was like, wow, this is an amazing community that I wasn't that aware of, even though I do reference those institutional academic histories in the book. And then that's only continued. But I would say the thing that I've noticed now is that the number of requests that I get at the Museum of Arts and Design for loans of work from that period of like the first and second generation of fiber artists is just like through the roof at this point. Yeah. So there's these major exhibitions that are happening that really we didn't have much interface with these other institutions until very recently. And then you also see a phenomenon of these artists that MAD has supported for many years. In fact, I would say the large majority of their careers suddenly having opportunities to show at other institutions for the first time, and larger institutions and much more prestigious institutions. So like the Tate did an amazing series of female artists working in textiles. The Whitney had a show that was related to craft. There's an upcoming Claire Zeisler retrospective. I mean, it's really amazing to me.
So I went back and read Stringfelt Thread, which I think is a fantastic book, by the way. People should check it out. One of the things that strikes me, and you do a really good job of talking about some of these tensions, that there's not just one thing going on. There are like people working in studio textiles or working in traditional loom work.
Yeah,
who
what
are
generally goes by the term studio craft in that field.
Craft.
Yeah.
Who are looking to break out of that box and become treated as artists. There's like post-minimalism and artists like Robert Morris, Eva Hesse, who work with non-traditional materials and suddenly fiber becomes interesting to them. And then there's feminist art, where feminist artists in the second wave, the 70s, were really looking to domestic forms of creativity that were overlooked and finding symbolic resonance in them. And you really classify that last one as really doing the most to like question what was art and why it had been excluded and why certain things were treated as really exalted and other things less so. But I guess in terms of the present, I mean, it seems like there's an obvious parallel that there was like a feminist conversation in the 70s that drove forward interest in textiles and social movements that made people look to other cultures outside of the European culture that had been defined by painting and sculpture. And that seems very similar. That seems to me what's happening in the last 5-6 years.
Oh, I see what you mean. Right. So the feminists of the 70s and early 80s that appropriated women's craft or did the deep dive into women's history and looked for places where women could work as creative actors in the world. In doing that, they were also looking to deflate the power of the hierarchy of art and craft. Like they needed to be able to expose it as completely exclusionary and constructed, right? Because they're working in an art world that's it's so naturalized that you can't see that. So their elevation of women's craft helped to do that. That was part of their strategy to deflate the power of that hierarchy. And they were very, very good at it. And it politicize that hierarchy for the first time. That continues when you see those phrases like, oh, this is an artist who's motivated by the marginalization of women's craft. That's like a politicization of that hierarchy that started with feminist artists and their use of women's craft and the integration of it into their work. And it has been absolutely reinvigorated, I would say recently, especially by queer artists. So you're seeing a generation of queer artists who pick up that mantle of like political approach or intervention into various hierarchies. And of course, one of the other things that feminists were saying is that this is a hierarchy in the art world which reflects other hierarchies in the world at large, hierarchies of gender, race, sexuality, class. So they're all connected. And then so you see younger artists today that can attach also sort of activist projects to these materials because of the way they've been politicized, and is still working very well as their artistic strategy. I don't know if that's going to last forever, but right now it's been completely revitalized, and there's a whole range of new work that's been inspired by that feminist moment. It's really quite gratifying to see that.
So one of the many marks of interest in textiles right now is this big exhibition called Woven Histories, Textiles and Modern Abstraction, which was at the National Gallery in DC and LACMA in LA and is currently at the National Gallery of Canada, and it'll be at MoMA next year. You wrote a essay for the catalog, and that kind of looks back at some of this history. So what is the relationship that it draws or that you would draw between textiles and abstraction in terms of how textiles enter into the art conversation?
I think there's a number of intersections. So the way I understand Lynn's project is that you can't tell the history of modernism, or the history of abstraction, I should say, without really taking into consideration work in fiber, whether it's woven work, fashion, other kinds of structures. They've been pulled apart because of the way these materials have been excluded over time. But this is an exhibition that wants to put those things back in relationship to each other. So like one example is the beautiful Sophie Tauber ARP needlepoints, right?
What are those?
These little needlepoints, abstract compositions that she made. And she was working on those while she was working on other works of abstract art. And she moved very comfortably between those worlds. There's other artists that are in the exhibition, some of whom produced commercial patterns for sewing or crochet, but were also working as artists identified as part of the invention of abstraction in the period. So I'm talking about the early 20th century, those artists that start out the exhibition. This is like an area of exploration that these artists were doing across genres. They weren't just like starting out in painting and exclusively working in painting. They were also making their own fashions. Sonia Delaney's abstract patchwork, right, quilt for her child, eventually moves into the world of fashion design. This is a person who's not interested necessarily in those boundaries. And there were a lot of artists like that in that period. It's just that the canon that you're taught, probably even to this day, I would imagine, hopefully not after exhibitions like this, help to revise that canon. You're generally just taught that they are painters and that's what counts and that's all that matters. And these other sources or other trajectories of exploration when it comes to abstraction are just, eclipsed.
One of the terms I took away from the book was craft anxiety. This idea that a lot of textile artists in the 1960s had this anxiety about being just treated as craftspeople.
Right.
And so did the abstract expressionists, who were the hot artists of that time period. And
worried that they would be written off as decorative.
They were constantly concerned with being written off as decorative. And this was this huge anxiety of like that you had to be more than just decorative. I just think that's really interesting that in a certain sense, I think they hold the center of the conversation. Abstract expressionism is the first big American art movement that's internationally recognized. So kind of everybody else is kind of sitting in the shadow of that. But at the same time, they have to take this thing that doesn't necessarily have an obvious craft to the average person who's just like, my kid could do that. And they have to figure out a way to be considered as more than that. And somehow that opens up a space for a bunch of other things that were just considered pattern to be kind of move into the status of art. Is that too optimistic a reading of what happened in that time period?
Probably too optimistic. Wait, I'm not quite following you. I know what you're saying. So these are artists who are very defensive about the legitimacy of their work as painting, even though it's abstract, right? And so what they do is exclude every reference that could somehow be a liability for them, whether it's wallpaper or some other form of decoration.
Right. They're terrified they're going to be treated like wallpaper.
Right. Or it's too precious or it's too finished, right? Anything that might be associated with what they would refer to as a non-art form. I don't think it's like opening up a space for other things. It's more, in my mind, like a way of excluding other things. For fiber artists working in the late 60s, these are artists that are, I can't think of a single example where this is not true. They're training, they're being professionalized to work within industry, right? So they are learning to weave and they weave samples that can be then produced as commercial product like upholstery or other fabrics for fashion and the interiors. So if they're going to remake themselves as sculptors, or let's just say generic artists, they also have anxiety and a lot of liabilities, right? Things that have to do with the commercial world or the domestic space or the everyday or the idea of women sitting at a loom, like the stereotype of the old lady doing knitting in her lap, like all of those associations, they're trying to get away from that as well, right? And enter the art world in a very different high plane that exists only to represent like formal innovation or work out an idea, the conceptual drive. That's what they're going for, but you have to exclude everything else to do that.
It's an anecdote from the book that I love, which is the first big museum show that tried to reframe studio art textiles as art was called Wall Hangings at the MoMA in '69 and had a lot of these figures you mentioned, like Sheila Hicks in it, who are very popular now, and got, you say, one review in a national magazine, which was by Louis Bourgeois, the great...
In Craft Horizons.
The great surrealist sculptor who hated the show.
Because in her mind, it was too applied and it doesn't rise to the occasion of serious, rigorous art. And it largely has to do with these associations that we have with anything that attaches itself to craft or the decorative, like too quotidian, too feminine, too domestic, too commercial. I mean, there's a very long list of exclusions. But there is one exhibition before that, which was 1964 at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, just giving my own institution a plug. We're called the Museum of Arts and Design today, but they did a large-scale show also of some of the first works that these same artists were producing as they were making that transition away from the loom. It was called woven forms. So these are also categorical terms like wall hangings, woven forms that get thrown around a lot in that period because it was very difficult for people to identify and the desire to categorize these works.
So you already mentioned it, but you see a lot of textile work now. And there's a phrase that you mentioned that constantly comes up. They are questioning the traditional marginalization of craft practices. It grates on me because it's boilerplate and a cliche at this point. And also because, as you have been talking about, this process has been being undone for a long time. But the theoretical thing I love about your book is how much you complicate that idea, because you really show that there are people that it's not as simple as like questioning things that are traditionally referred to as craft or treated as craft. Like people are going in all different directions, and there's a lot of tension over this because sometimes to transcend craft means that the people
just leave the hierarchy the way it is and try to escape it and move up the ladder of status, right? It doesn't do anything in terms of transforming or trying to deflate the power and injustice of that hierarchy. So that's where a lot of fiber artists got stuck, right? Because it was a matter of simply trying to reposition yourself within the contemporary art world. It wasn't going to have the effect that, say, feminist artists might have attacking that hierarchy for being the reason for that marginalization in the first place and forcing you to rethink what a more equitable or open canon of art history would look like.
Yeah, and there are vibrant communities of, quilters, knitters, who have their own independent art worlds that are being also treated as the thing to transcend, to get out of. And there are a lot of interesting debates in that time period about that. And today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you have a lot of process artists working, I think, in counter direction from fiber artists in the sense that they're looking to really tear down sculpture, that category itself, like the permanence and the durability and the use of marble and bronze, right? They're going to make things that look like nothing except like a pile of felt on the floor. So you've got fiber artists trying to move up the scale. They need the category of art to remain the way it is for them to do that. And then you have people who are more at the center of the art world who have quite a bit of power looking to tear that down at the same time.
So you work at the Museum of Arts and Design, and I guess my question is, today, there is this interest within a certain kind of contemporary art world in galleries and contemporary art museums in craft. And in the 60s, some of the ambition of the feminist artists was to connect with new kinds of audiences, that it wasn't just an interest abstractly in craft. It was like, no, we want to build bridges with women who, they're these communities that we work with. And then you talk about in your book, as you said, about the sort of revival and interest in crafts connects to revival of interest in crafting and, DIY culture to a certain extent, I don't know, a hipster interest in making your own clothes and stuff like that. Is there a different audience? And is the project of reaching out to new audiences through craft, is that a successful avenue?
Let me go back to the first point about feminists consciously looking to go beyond art audiences, because I think they were very successful. Certain feminist artists, I'm thinking of people like Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, others of their circle, and they were very, very committed to what I would call, and other scholars call, a woman's art world, right? Which did exist. I mean, I'm old enough to remember just about any city I've ever lived in. There was a women's bookstore. There was a women's film festival. There were music festivals. There was the Feminist Poetry Project. I mean, this was an incredibly creative and vibrant world that ran in parallel to mainstream economies, the mainstream art world. And it didn't really matter what was going on in those mainstream worlds because this was meant to exist to the extent it could outside of like patriarchal culture. And they were very, very successful. I mean, Miriam Shapiro, she would go on these national tours just to talk about her work and the work of other women artists and the history of women's crafts. There's just hundreds of women who would come, and she had like a fan base. I mean, Judy has a fan base too. They were very vibrant art worlds. I think they still exist. I'm less in touch with them, but they were successful in doing that and reaching like a much broader popular audience. Today, I see what you mean. Like there is a connection to maybe the rise of DIY culture. For sure, that's what helped me pitch this book to finally an editor who got it and saw that there was that connection in the legacy of the 60s and 70s that I was talking about. And then I would also say the rise of artisanal culture is super important because that's really where creativity is in people's lives. So they get into wine or they get into cheese or there's the cannabis thing. There's all of that. People who are in those worlds totally accept it as a legitimate creative practice, and they should. Some of them would go as far as identifying as artists, as they should. And then there's also revival of like heritage brands by young members of families that still own them. You know, I'm thinking of like the shoe brand Red Wing. That's just one of many, right? Where you take over the company and you rebrand it. And what you do is focus on the origin story of the handmade and you make sure that that's central to what's being made going forward, right? That's another version of this artisanal phenomenon. And just in general, people appreciating creative activity outside of this tiny little thing we call the contemporary art world is a really positive phenomenon. And accepting yourself as a creative person.
One of the things I was thinking of is in an earlier podcast, I looked at which artists are showing in the most museums. And the one who was showing in the most museums right now is this artist, Marie Watt. She works in textiles. And one of the things she does is convene sewing circles. And, you know, museums host them or institutions host them. And it's a way of like tapping into this audience of creative makers.
I'm glad that you brought that up because craft is really good at bringing communities together. And so you do see that quite often when it's about indigenous identities and histories. Absolutely. There's so many of those wonderful projects that bring people back together through hand making. And it's that hand making process as a group is a kind of space of potentiality in some way to think about a different future or a history and your place in it going forward, maybe. Sonia Clark, another artist from the textile world, is a great example of someone who also creates large-scale participatory projects where anyone at any skill level can come in and participate through sewing or through weaving at a loom, through instruction, etc. And it connects to histories, American history, the legacy of slavery in the U.S. and like how to think about issues of equity and how to move forward together as a community, being responsible to each other. So craft is often at the center of those experiences.
I feel like you often hear that language. Maybe this is from Miriam Shapiro or Harmony Hammond in your book, this idea of sewing as a craft that's about bringing things together. I wonder if you see a kind of reversal in something you just said, because I do think there was this moment of kind of bringing textiles or fiber into the art space, or that was the aspiration. That was like where the energy was. And I wonder if you think there's a danger there in de-skilling. You take a thing that has its own basis and tradition and putting it in a place where it's appreciated in a more conceptual register and appreciated for its ideas instead of for the making of it. And then B, I wonder, I do think some amount of interest in textiles as art right now must have to do in my head with how shoddy our commercial textiles are. I mean, in the age of Shein and fast fashion, I mean, our clothes are actually really degraded. And to me, it's like I'm almost just personally less interested in seeing de-skilled conceptual use of fabrics and more interested in like seeing G's Ben quilts, which are like these incredible objects that have this made quality and you feel like you're looking at a tradition.
I know what you're talking about. So the audience that I have at the Museum of Arts and Design, they're open to quite a bit. They'd be just as open to a construction made out of found textiles as they are to, say, a virtuosic weaving on the loom. But I really think what they love the most and what I respond to too is something that I can look at it and really be wowed by the use of materials and a certain level of expertise that's grounded in a craft tradition. I tend towards that in exhibitions there because I know that You can see a conceptual work where that kind of virtuosity is not the gold standard at almost any museum, right? But if you want to see something where you have makers who are coming out of those worlds and are sort of highly trained, you can find that at MAD. And there is something about those materials that's really very satisfying, and seeing someone be able to manipulate them in expert ways. It's not unusual for me to encounter audiences at MAD who do know the level of expertise that should go into these kinds of objects, and be very dismissive of artists who just decide to pick up ceramics today, right? And create something. They can see it a mile away. Even though I do love the work that demonstrates mastery, let's say, of materials, I'm also trained as a modernist. I love the conceptual art world too. So I can go back and forth, and I can see there's other reasons for why you'd want to just pick up ceramics today and work with it in an unusual way that's not going to display, say, a long-term investment in skill building, right? But yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it related to clothing. Like, the cheapness of things around us gets really old after a while. And so maybe that has something to do with the way even I've grown more open to things that really can sometimes be written off in the contemporary art world, like virtuosity or attention to technique or the use of very kind of precious materials or unusual materials. I'm like much more interested in that now than I ever have been.
I do feel like this is a recurring thing in the history of modernism and artistic development, is these kind of waves of reaction to different forms of industrialization, and then a return to craft, whether in the arts and craft movement or in the 60s, turn to textiles as art. But I take what you're saying. Fiber art can be a big tent.
It is a big tent.
Do you think it's secure? I mean, we've talked about like the recurrent interest, which must mean that there are recurrent falling offs of interest. So it does seem like there's been a moment.
It's been very uneven, true, through history, but I feel like the art world's just changed too much to allow this to happen. For it to go backwards or drop off doesn't seem realistic to me anymore. So I feel like it's secure, yes. I don't know what it's going to look like 5 years from now, but I think it's secure.
Well, we'll have you back in 5 years.
Okay, we can pick it up.
Thank you so much for coming in. I'm just so excited by the topic, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
Thank you. I'm excited that you're excited by the topic. It's terrific.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. We're on all the platforms. Also, take a moment to rate and review our podcast. It does help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.